What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 3 of One with Nothing. I am your host, Salvage, and today we are looking at all 5 new Myojins from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty through the lens of Commander. Wizards of the Coast released the first Myojin series back in 2004 with Champions of Kamigawa. So if you were around to remember those Myojins and no one's made you feel old yet today, you're welcome. And now, just as then, all the Myojins have this tricky oracle text that makes them infamously difficult to run as your commander. Lucky for us, infamously difficult commanders are what we are all about. So without further ado, here are my takes on how I would personally build each of the new Myojins as my commanders. All Myojins have the oracle text, this creature enters the battlefield with an indestructible counter on it if you cast it from your hand. Then each of the Myojin have an extremely powerful ability that you can activate by removing the indestructible counter. This means we need to cast the Myojin from our hand in order to maximize their potential and to have some real fun. We do not get the indestructible counter from casting from the command zone. To overcome this obstacle, I highly recommend that you run the following cards. First up, we have Command Beacon. Command Beacon is a colorless land, and you can also tap and sacrifice it to put your commander into your hand from the command zone. I also recommend you run Erratic Portal. This is a 4-cost artifact that lets you pay 1, tap it, and return target creature to its owner's hand unless its controller pays 1. Erratic Portal is a fantastic include across all the Myojin decks because 1, we can use it to bounce our Myojins to our hand to recast for their indestructible counter ability, and 2, we can also use this for an added layer of control on our opponent's creatures when they're tapped out. Dragon's Mask is another artifact that works perfectly with our Myojin. For 3 mana, we can tap Dragon's Mask, target creature you control gets +2/+2 until the end of turn, and at the end of turn, if that creature is in play, we return it to our hand. Noetic Scales is another artifact that will let us place our commander back into our hand. For 4 mana, we cast Noetic Scales and get the effect, during each player's upkeep, return to owner's hand each creature that player controls with power greater than the number of cards in his or her hand. Since most of the Myojins have a considerable power, mid to late game, this artifact almost guarantees us that we will be able to return our Myojin and get that cast from hand trigger later on. Lastly, among these universal artifacts is the artifact That Which Was Taken. This is an extremely fun one, all the way back from Betrayers and Kamigawa, that was initially printed for use with the original Myojin series. For 5 colorless mana, we play this legendary artifact, and then for 4, we can tap it to put a divinity counter on target permanent other than that which was taken. Each permanent with a divinity counter on it is indestructible. So the divinity counters were the original name for the indestructible counters that came in on the Myojins when you cast them from your hand. I don't have any information on this point whether this text will be errated to include the new Myojin, but I sincerely hope it does, and I expect that it will. It's just a matter of time. Now for some artifacts that we can run in all the Myojin decks that will help us get added value from their activated abilities. First up, we have Contagion Engine. This is a 6 mana artifact. When Contagion Engine enters the battlefield, we put a -1/-1 counter on each creature target player controls. And for 4 colorless mana, we can Proliferate and then Proliferate again. Proliferate is an ability that lets us target any permanent on the field with a counter on it, and we can add another one of the same type of counter. It works with -1/-1 counters, +1/+1 counters, planeswalker counters, and yes, it will work with the indestructible counters on our Myojin. This leads to absolutely insane interactions. On their own, for just a single activation, the Myojin's abilities are extremely powerful, but once you have 2, 3, even more of them happening at a time, it is just absolutely cataclysmic. So Contagion Engine is a perfect fit. Likewise, Contagion Clasp is just a mini Contagion Engine that costs less and has a slightly reduced effect. For 2 mana, we get to put this artifact down, and then for 4 mana, we can tap it and Proliferate, but only once. Even just 1 Proliferate, however, is more than enough to get an extreme amount of value out of our commander when we play it from our hand, so Contagion Clasp is an include in all of these decks. Throne of Geth, likewise, is another 2 mana artifact that comes down. We can tap and sacrifice Throne of Geth to Proliferate. Throne of Geth can sacrifice itself, so even if we're in a deck that doesn't have a lot of artifacts, we will get at least 1 Proliferate trigger off of it and add another indestructible counter to our commander. So for each of these, I've also included the original Myojin side by side just for comparison's sake. As a fun sort of Easter egg, all of the new Myojins have exactly the same power and toughness as their predecessor. So Myojin of Cleansing Fire, when we remove that divinity counter, it destroys each other creature in play, which is a very powerful ability. In its latest form as Myojin of Blooming Dawn, we remove an indestructible counter to create a 1/1 colorless spirit creature token for each permanent we control. That is absolutely insane. By the time you have the mana to cast Myojin of Blooming Dawn from your hand, you most likely already have 8, 10, or more permanents on the battlefield. That means that once we cast this at the end of our opponent's turn before we get to untap with Myojin, we get to remove that counter and put down 10, 12, or more creatures, which just leads to some absolutely crazy options and interactions on our turn. So how are we going to build this deck? You already know what I'm going to do with this card. As soon as I saw this card, the first thing I knew I obviously had to do was Bell Tribal. Not many people are familiar with Bell Tribal, and if you're one of them, Bell Tribal is simply a collection of all the biggest and most powerful hard-hitting bells in Magic. We're talking Ghoul Caller's Bell, we're talking Temple Bell, Village Bell Ringer, all of these big, beautiful bells. This one, Cormus Bell, is really going to upset the table. This is a 4-drop colorless bell, continuous artifact. Treat all swamps in play as 1/1 creatures. Now they can be enchanted, killed, and so forth, and they can be tapped either for mana or to attack. Swamps have no color, and they are not considered black cards. I'm sure you know from your own games, any player in black, when this thing comes down, almost just scoops on sight. I mean, it's the Cormus Bell we're talking about, people. And no Bell Tribal strategy would be complete without Junkio Bell. This is a 4-cost bell that comes down as an artifact. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may have target creature you control get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures that you control. If you do, sacrifice that creature at the end of turn. So this one has a fantastic interaction with Myojin of the Blooming Dawn. If, for example, we have Myojin on the field with its indestructible counter, and on our opponent's end step, we remove that counter and put down 10, 12, or more permanents, then suddenly on our upkeep, we can have our Myojin of Blooming Dawn get +10 or more power and toughness for that turn. That can turn Myojin into a lethal 1 or 2-shot commander. Yes, we have to sacrifice it at the end of turn if we happen not to delete a player, but with all the ways that we're running to get the Myojin back into our hand, that's not really going to be a problem. We're also going to get to keep those other spirits, so we're still going to have a ton of blockers after we just absolutely run train through one of our opponents with the Junkio Bell. I think it's an excellent include. No Bell deck is complete without it. Also with Myojin of the Blooming Dawn, we've got a lot of this beautiful flowers and clouds going on, so I'm also going to be throwing in some Cloud Chaser Kestrels into this deck for those enchantment destroys. Cloud Chaser's big brother or big sister, Aven Cloud Chaser, also comes down and destroys an enchantment. And Geist Honored Monk is another one I'll be putting in this. Geist Honored Monk runs excellently alongside a Bell Tribal deck. It's very flavorful, and she's also going to be bringing in 2 1/1 white spirits with her, and that's going to make her quite big. Lastly, we're going to have Grateful Apparition in the deck. This is a 2-cost 1/1 spirit. Unfortunately, it's not a bell, but it is a spirit. It comes in as a flyer, and whenever Grateful Apparition deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, we proliferate. So we are already going to be running those colorless artifacts, the Contagion Clasp and Contagion Engine that proliferates, but playing in white, we have this additional excellent option of Grateful Apparition that can put yet another indestructible counter on our Myojin. If we have 2 or 3 of those counters on this creature, we can slam down 30 or more of these spirit tokens whenever we want to, and that is absolutely nuts. You know, one of these days, Bell Tribal might get banned, and I'll understand, but until then, we are going to run wild with it. Next up, we have Myojin of Cryptic Dreams. This is a 3/3 legendary creature spirit. Remove an indestructible counter from Myojin of Cryptic Dreams, and we get to copy target permanent spell 3 times. That artwork, it gives us some pretty big clues about what Wizards was thinking when they made it. This is going to be a commander where we're going to be making lots of tokens, but not just any tokens. We are going to be taking advantage of all those blue cards and those abilities that let us copy legendary creatures. We're not just going to be satisfied with copying a permanent 3 times. We're going to want multiple Myojins on the battlefield so we can copy 6, 9, 12, however many more times, and really cause the game to spiral out of control, hopefully in our favor. So to accomplish that, we are running Mirror Gallery. The legend rule does not apply to us with this artifact, and then Mirror Box, which is also releasing with the new set. Mirror Box is a 3-cost artifact. It comes down and says the legend rule does not apply to permanents you control. Each legendary creature you control gets +1/+1, and each non-token creature you control gets +1/+1 for each other creature that you control with the same name as that creature. This is just begging us to make as many copies as possible of Myojin of Cryptic Dreams, and we're going to try to do that. We're going to use Mirror Hall Mimic because it is on theme, of course, and it'll also come in as a copy of Myojin of Cryptic Dreams with that divinity counter. Because it comes in as a copy and we cast it from our hands, it does get that indestructible counter on it. Because we're in blue, we also have access to Sakashima the Imposter, which is going to be excellent utility for us. Sakashima of 1,000 Faces, the same thing. We're going to get to make more copies of our commander or other creatures that we have in play. And then once we have all these copies and we can copy so many permanents from our hands using the activated ability of Cryptic Dreams, what do we want to do with it? Well, I think it'd be very fun to have 3, 6, 9, 12 Gilded Drakes that you can plop down on the field and then exchange for whatever creatures your opponents have. And the more I considered this, I also started thinking about that Cryptic Dreams aspect of the name. It really made me start to think, what are the terrifying creatures that blue has access to that we can get a kick out of copying so many times? One of those things that occurred to me was Inkwell Leviathan. Inkwell Leviathan is a 7/11 Island Walk, Trample, and Shroud. It doesn't even have legendary on it, so we don't necessarily have to worry about that rule. But yeah, I think I'd enjoy having 3, 6, 9, or more of these puppies on my side of the field. Likewise, we've got Hullbreaker Horror. Hullbreaker Horror is a 7-cost, 7/8 with Flash. It can't be countered, which is wonderful. You know, you don't want to burn that indestructible activation on a spell that just fizzles. Hullbreaker Horror has then the broken ability, whenever you cast a spell, choose up to 1. We can return a spell we don't control to its owner's hand, or we can return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, which means we can bounce our Cryptic Dreams back if we need to get another indestructible counter by casting it again. And then lastly, you could really put in anything here. I think I personally would enjoy running Geralf's Mind Crusher. When Mind Crusher enters the battlefield, target player puts the top 5 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So just casting this once is fairly good. We would get the 5 cards, and then when it dies with Undying, it will come back and get us another 5. But if we copy it, that's 3 copies coming down, at least 15 cards plus the 5 from Undying, 20 cards. And then if we have extra activations of the Myojin, or we have more copies of the Myojin, this can just spiral out of control and just erase chunks of or our opponent's entire libraries at a time. I think that's a very fun way to go about ending the game. Next, we have Myojin of Grim Betrayal. For 8, this is a 5/2 and remove an indestructible counter from Myojin of Grim Betrayal to put onto the battlefield under our control all creature cards in all graveyards that were put there from anywhere this turn. So when I saw this ability, the word that stands out the most on this card is that word anywhere, which means we have very many options when choosing how to build this. I personally wanted to go the mono black mill route because since we can get the activation from anywhere, we have access to a lot of cards in black that can get creatures into the yard from the field, of course, but also players' hands and also their libraries. In black, we also have access to Netherborn Altar, which will allow us to tap and put our commander into our hand from the command zone. This is another way we can get around that cast from hand clause on the commander, and I think it is an auto include in any Myojin of Night's Reach or Myojin of Grim Betrayal deck. So to put those cards from the top of our opponent's library into their graveyard, we can play things like Dread Summons, which we pay X and 2 black. Each player puts the top X cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard, and for each creature card, we make a 2/2 black zombie creature token onto our side of the field tap. There's lots of these effects in black that take a symmetrical amount of cards from each player's library and puts them into the graveyard. Another example of that is Eye Collector. A similar effect is on Mindrack Harpy. This is a 3/2 flyer. At the beginning of combat on our turn, each player puts the top 3 cards of their library into their graveyard. This one's excellent because once we cast it the first time, then every time before combat, we're going to get that activation, which is going to put 12 cards in the yard across the entire field if we have all our opponents, and give us access to a potentially devastating activation of Myojin of Grim Betrayal's ability. Then another extremely fun interaction with black is Mind Crank and Pestilence, I think. So with Mind Crank, anytime our opponents lose life, they're going to put that many cards from their library into their yard. Excellent utility for Myojin of Grim Betrayal, but also the interaction with Pestilence is a lot of fun. Pestilence is 2 and 2 black, and we can pay any spare black mana that we have to ding everything on the board for 1 damage and every player. The best part about this is that our Myojin of Grim Betrayal will have indestructible as long as its counter is there, which means it doesn't care how many times Pestilence hits it, it will live, and everything else around it will slowly die. When those things that die hit the yard, we can decide to remove the indestructible counter, or we can just keep it up to keep pressure on the board and then use it however we see fit. Some great pieces to include in a deck like this: I would throw in Oblivion Stone and Nev Disc just so that we have those board clear options. Your commander is going to survive both of these effects because they're destroy effects so long as we have that counter. And then as soon as all the other creatures are destroyed, we can remove the counter and bring them back onto the field under our control. Heartless Summonings is one of those cards that I always am looking for a nice home for. Heartless Summonings is a 1 and a black enchantment that says creature spells we cast cost 2 less to cast, and creatures that we control get -1/-1. In this case, we're not really going to care if our 5/2 commander becomes a 4/1. We are going to care that we can then cast it from our hand for just 6 mana for that ridiculously powerful ability. Not to mention, any other creatures that we want to cast will be cheaper as well. I think this is an extremely fun one to include. And then lastly, we have Dark Deal. Dark Deal is 2 and a black to have each player discard all cards in hand and then draw that many cards -1. This is just another way, sort of a different way to hopefully dump some creatures in the yard. Our opponents don't even get to pick and choose which ones, it's their entire hand. So this will be very fun and open up some options for our commander. Moving on to red, we have Myojin of Roaring Blades. I mean, the art here is fantastic. All of the artwork so far has just been absolute bangers, but I really enjoy the swords in particular that Myojin of Roaring Blades is holding. It really makes me want to build around him as a warrior tribal or a samurai tribal deck, just because that ability on him really doesn't care what else we put into this deck. Myojin of Roaring Blades says we can remove an indestructible counter to deal 7 damage to each of up to 3 targets. So we can throw around 21 damage anytime we want to, as long as he has an indestructible counter. Now, red is fantastic at a couple things, but when I see a card like this, the only thing I am thinking is how can I abuse and copy that ability as much as possible? And so in red, we've got access to really fun enchantments like Dictate of the Twin Gods, Furnace of Wrath, and Gratuitous Violence that are all going to do exactly that. They all are going to double the amount of damage that our permanents are dealing. They will also double the damage that we're taking, but what we're trying to do is set up really a one-shot kill to the entire table, and that is very possible with this commander. With these 3 enchantments out, any instance of damage that we do to somebody is going to be multiplied by 8. Doubled for Dictate, quadrupled for Furnace of Wrath, and then 8 times more damage if we happen to have all 3 of these on the field, which means we can throw around 168 damage, and that's not even all. There are more effects we could have down, like Angrath Marauders, other ones I'm sure you could find in red that will continue doubling. I think it's just extraordinarily hilarious to think that removing a counter could be so lethal to every player at once. And that's to say nothing of copying the ability itself. We can use a card like Battle Mage's Bracers to throw on the Myojin, and then once we remove that indestructible counter, we can pay 1 to copy that ability. And even with just 1 or maybe 2 of those damage doubling enchantments, that is a quick way to close out the game. And then lastly, we have the Myojin of Towering Might, an 8-cost 8/8. When we remove Myojin of Towering Might's indestructible counter, he will distribute 8 +1/+1 counters among any number of target creatures that we control, and those creatures will gain trample until the end of turn. I think this is an extremely fun and incredibly powerful ability, but I wanted to think of a way to use it that was a little off the beaten path, and so I thought modular with this ability would be a lot of fun. You don't see very many mono green commanders running around with an artifact tribal theme, especially one that works so well with +1/+1 counters. So I'll be putting cards in this deck like Arcbound Slith. This is a 2-cost creature with modular 1. Whenever Arcbound Slith deals combat damage to a player, we can put a +1/+1 counter on it. And creatures with modular, when they die, they can move all of their +1/+1 counters onto other artifact creatures. So the more modular creatures we have down and the bigger that they're growing throughout the game, the more value we get off of them when they die, especially if we have activated our Myojin of Towering Might and put 8 more +1/+1 counters on them. We'll also be running Scrapyard Recombiner. This will let us sack an artifact to search our library for another construct card and put it into our hand, so we'd be fetching more modular cards. Arcbound Overseer is an 8 cost, but in green, we are going to have no trouble getting to 8 at all, and we're going to have some cards that help us get there. Arcbound Overseer is going to put a +1/+1 counter on all our modular creatures when we untap, and it comes in as modular 6, so it is a 6/6, and when it dies, 6 more counters to move around. A couple creatures I would definitely throw in as well are Renata Call to the Hunt, which is going to give each of our creatures an extra +1/+1 counter when we cast them. And then Selvala, Heart of the Wild, will tap for a green and add X mana in any combination of colors where X is the greatest power among creatures we control. If we get her down early, fantastic. If we get her down mid-game, she will most likely be able to just tap and pay for a hard cast of Myojin of Towering Might from our hand or the command zone. Awesome to include in the deck. A few more fun ones, Arcbound Reclaimer. This is going to put an artifact card from our graveyard on top of our library with some great recursion. And then Solidarity of Heroes and Biogenic Upgrade. Both of these spells are just capable of doubling the amount of counters on our creatures. Green has no trouble doing this, but I think it's extremely fun and funny to do this on artifact creatures instead of green's normal big beastie tramplers. Instead we're going to have big beastie scrap heaps running towards people led by the Myojin of Towering Might. So that is all for my takes on how I would personally build these new Myojin coming out in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. As a reminder, Kamigawa Neon Dynasty is coming to your local game store on Friday, February 11th. That is the pre-release date. I want to thank you all so much again for checking out my channel. As always, please wear your seatbelts out there, and if there is an upcoming election and you're eligible to vote, I highly encourage you to do so. Please go do it. And if you want to try it out, if you want to practice voting, you could go ahead and vote for your favorite Myojin idea, or the one that you plan on building when you get your hands on one of these new legendary spirits from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. Cheers.